Take a look at life in this small town in Latin America. Back in the early 1970s, it was the fastest growing metropolis on its continent. Girls in bright dresses walk down the streets, shiny cars race by, and popular Western music pours from every corner. And here's that same city today. This is Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, one of the most dangerous countries in the world, where most crimes go unsolved. All because 1/3 of the local population can't find work. The currency is losing hundreds of percent in value every year, and the government is drowning in corruption. So what turned Caracas from a thriving nation into the most depressing region in all of South America in just 50 years? The answer lies beneath the ground. It's oil. Venezuela will start producing it on a massive scale in 1914 because it turns out the country has more oil than anyone else in the world. From 1935 onward, the country lives entirely off the export of black gold. And with massive oil revenues, the Venezuelan government starts throwing money around left and right, while society turns a blind eye to countless unsolved problems. When oil prices collapse in the 1980s, Venezuela's economy starts falling apart so fast that within just a few years, the country goes from the richest corner of South America to the poorest and most dangerous region on the continent. And Venezuela is far from the exception. Over the past decades, oil has toppled dozens of leaders. Today, black gold shapes global economic policy entirely and remains the driving force behind modern wars. So why is it that countries sitting on millions of tons of oil and gas are drowning in their own problems? And how did some nations manage to escape the resource curse? In this video, we'll break down how oil became the main engine of the global economy and why it can make some rich beyond imagination and destroy others. How do you cure the oil disease? And why do countries sit on trillions of petrodollars without spending them on today's problems? Let's find out. The story of oil's rise to economic Olympus began in the middle of the 19th century, when Canadian physician and geologist Abraham Gessner extracted a strange liquid from petroleum, a liquid with one remarkable quality. It burned incredibly bright and incredibly well. This new substance, which Abraham patented under the name kerosene, sparked a true cultural revolution. Within just a few years, kerosene not only replaced gas in street lamps around the world, it also saved the largest animals on the planet from extinction. Because in the hunt for whale oil, the main source of artificial light in the pre-kerosene era, humans had slaughtered hundreds of thousands of animals. And once kerosene was discovered, killing whales became simply unprofitable. Producing the new substance cost dozens of times less than hunting at sea. With the arrival of kerosene, oil finally transformed from a building material and an ancient weapon into the most effective source of light. A few years later, people invent two more ways to refine oil. Thanks to this, Carl Benz creates the first car with a gasoline engine, and later, another type of engine is invented by a man with a famous last name, Rudolf Diesel. When American entrepreneur Henry Ford builds on the work of these German inventors, he releases the first car that sells by the millions. And that's when it becomes clear oil is taking its place as the main resource of the global economy for decades to come. And that's exactly what happened. By the start of World War II, control over oil reserves had become a key objective for every major power. In fact, one of the reasons Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union was the desire to seize Soviet oil fields along the Caspian Sea. And when reaching Soviet oil proved impossible, and Romania, the Third Reich's main oil supplier, switched sides to join the Allies, the German army lost its last chance at victory. The end of World War II triggered a new wave of industrial growth and demand for oil. The global economy began expanding even faster, especially thanks to the rapid rise of the United States, which had been left untouched by the war. While the rest of the world was still recovering, by the 1960s, the United States was already producing half of all the cars in the world. And of course, the pace of fuel production could no longer keep up with the growth of the global economy. By this point, regions with rich oil reserves, like the Persian Gulf and Africa, became the focus of intense global attention and geopolitical interest. And the oil shortage explains very well why these regions have seen some of the most brutal military conflicts of the past decades. In short, by the 1960s, oil became the world's main energy resource. For every country lucky enough to have it, oil became both a blessing and a curse. Some countries, like the Soviet Union, after getting hooked on the oil needle, suddenly collapsed from within, while others, like Qatar, after discovering oil, transformed from a desert into the place that hosts one of the most expensive sporting events in the world. But what explains this difference? Look, every oil power shares the exact same problem. When your country suddenly finds oil, you basically become a lottery winner. You'll most likely start selling that oil because your economy simply can't absorb such a volume. The export of black gold sends a flood of foreign currency straight into your budget's pockets. But to spend that money inside your own economy, you have to convert foreign currency into your national currency. And that's when the exchange rate starts climbing fast. At this point, it turns out that with a strong currency, it's very convenient to import foreign goods because they've suddenly become much cheaper for you. No need to produce anything yourself. You just buy quality imports right here, right now, at low prices. And it feels wonderful. Consumption levels rise, everyone gets shiny new iPhones and orders cars that used to be out of reach. But at the very same time, domestic businesses, the ones not involved in oil or other key resource extraction, have to compete with foreigners. And more often than not, they lose that competition. Now, domestic goods, both at home and abroad, cost more, simply because the national currency has gotten stronger. In the end, domestic businesses can't withstand the competition and get bought out by foreign companies. Some might say, well, that's what they deserve. That's how competition works. Only the strongest survive. But if the government lets this process run unchecked, sooner or later, the market gets flooded with foreign firms that become major players and start dictating their own terms. And the government should, in theory, be doing everything it can to prevent this. Because what's really at stake is the country's economic sovereignty. But why bother solving vague future problems when there are already oil billions under your feet? So when resource money is pouring into the country, the elites have no serious incentive to push tax or budget reforms. But it's not that simple. In mid-20th century Venezuela, of course, there were no real debates about the budget because there was money everywhere, and the authorities were handing out uncontrolled subsidies, essentially plugging every hole with oil money. And if they had thought about import substitution, developing other sectors of the economy, things would have turned out very differently. Wait, you might say, didn't they think about that? Well, actually, Venezuela's government in the 1960s did try to do exactly that. To escape the oil trap, the authorities allocated millions of bolivars to support domestic industry, but it didn't work because businessmen weren't fighting to improve product quality or increase production. They were fighting for access to those very same government funds. Venezuela's finance minister would later say, the most important weapon of a finance minister facing countless budget requests is his ability to say, there is no money, but how could I do that when there was so much money? Then, when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, Venezuela's government canceled countless budget transfers, both to businesses and to ordinary people, and the country was swept by massive riots that came to be known as El Caracazo, which isn't surprising because when you live off a single resource, your entire budget, your social stability, and your sovereignty depend on the unpredictable swings of one global commodity's price. But hold on, there are oil-rich countries that thrive precisely because of their resources. What's their secret? Why aren't they like Venezuela, Mexico, or Nigeria? Because these countries don't spend all their oil money. Instead, they stash it away in a separate piggy bank called a stabilization fund. These funds exist for one reason, so that when the government runs short on money for pensions or other budget expenses, it can tap into the oil reserves. To fill these funds, countries use something called fiscal rules. Essentially, a cutoff threshold. Let's say, if oil costs more than $50 per barrel, or if the government's oil revenues exceed $1 billion in a given year, the surplus goes straight into the fund. What that rule actually looks like? Each country decides for itself. Thanks to the stabilization fund, the economy doesn't get flooded with extra revenues from exports all at once, which means it avoids all those problems of the resource curse we talked about earlier. This is something that various populists often fail to understand, or don't want to understand, which is why ideas like, let's urgently spend the fund's money on construction, education, and other economic goals quickly catch on with the public. This happens year after year in Norway. But whenever a new opposition party comes to power there, for some reason it's in no rush to put these ideas into practice, because it's long been known where reckless spending leads. So the new government explains to the people that they'd overestimated what the fund could do, and the whole cycle starts over. By the way, Norway's pension fund is the largest stabilization fund in the world. Right now, it owns 1.5% of all stocks on the planet. The Norwegian fund holds shares in Apple, Nestlé, Microsoft, Samsung, and about 9,000 other companies. Sure, it's not BlackRock, the private fund that owns 5% of all companies in the world, but for a government pension fund, this is a jaw-dropping result. And these massive investments, mind you, are being made by a small northern country that's literally built on rocks, because less than 3% of its territory is suitable for farming. And yet, thanks to smart fiscal and tax policy, Norway consistently ranks at the top of the world's happiness and prosperity indexes. But Norway isn't the only one. Dozens of other countries have their own funds, and while the biggest funds have been built by oil exporters, far from all of them are as successful as Norway. If you lay out the countries as circles, where the size of the circle represents a country's proven oil reserves, you'll see that among the oil giants with the highest incomes and lowest unemployment, you'll find Qatar, the UAE, Canada, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. And somewhere in the middle of that group, our friend Norway. In the second group, with moderate unemployment and average incomes, you have Russia and Kazakhstan. And in the third, Venezuela, Iraq, and Iran, countries that, despite having some of the richest oil reserves on Earth, can't boast stable or prosperous economies. The resource curse hits these countries hardest because they failed to diversify their economies for various reasons, political ones above all. These countries are simply not attractive to foreign capital. Nobody's willing to invest in an economy where your assets could be nationalized any day now, and where you'd have no way to protect your rights. And investor sentiment is incredibly hard to change. That's exactly why Qatar hosted the most expensive World Cup in history, and why Saudi Arabian clubs are buying the world's most famous footballers for astronomical sums. All of it is part of a massive PR campaign to build a favorable investment image for their countries. As if to say, look, we're not just rich in oil. Come on, bring us your money. Though the resource curse, of course, isn't just about oil. Once upon a time, the mighty Spanish Empire was destroyed by the flood of gold from conquered Latin America. A little later, Argentina bet everything on agriculture and lost the global competition too, left with nothing. All in all, dozens of economies throughout history have collapsed because of their focus on a single resource. And it's clear that oil, which became the queen of the economy today, won't reign forever. By various estimates, the world's oil reserves will last only another 50 years. And even if that period stretches out longer, sooner or later, even today's ultra-wealthy Qatar could turn back into a desert, and Norway into just another unremarkable northern country. And that's exactly what will happen if resource-rich governments don't move fast enough to take advantage of the oil boom while it lasts. History shows that resources remain the main source of geopolitical power. Today, it's oil. Tomorrow, it could be something else entirely. But one thing is clear: while you're enjoying the gifts of the resource curse, it's slowly killing your economy. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. This is the very first video on Capital Decoded, a channel where we break down how money, power, and resources shape the world we live in. If you learned something today, let me know in the comments. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. See you soon.